Chapter 1 of the Rock Frog. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Linda Marie Nielsen, Vancouver, BC. Rock Frog by Harriet Anna Cheever. The Rock Frog. Ker Chunk sat on the edge of the stream, staring straight before him. He looked stuffy and wilful, and as if he meant to keep stuffy and wilful. Pretty soon he began crying, "Won't, won't, won't." "Oh," thought Ker Chunk's mother, "so he says I won't, does he? We will see, we will see." Now this Ker Chunk was a growing frog, and as frogs live chiefly close to the water, or in it, he was thinking of plunging into the pond, and having a fine time all by himself. But Ker Chunk's mother had told him to take Cleek Cleek, his little brother, with him into the pond, show him how to snap at tiny things that flew lazily by, and so teach him to feed himself. Cleek Cleek was a mite of a fellow with a tiny little tail, because, when frogs are very young, they do sport a little bit of a tail, which they lose as they grow larger. And when Ker Chunk thought of taking little stump-tailed Cleek Cleek with him into the pond, he decided that he would do no such thing, so he said in frog language, "Won't, won't, won't, won't." Cleek Cleek was only a little tadpole. Mrs. Frog had no mind to let one of her cold water boys say "I won't" to her, so what does she do, but up she catches Ker Chunk, and bobbing and leaping to the top of a great rock, she pushed him into a crevice, or wide crack, in a jutting piece of rock, just above the main stone that had the small entrance at the front. From this hole, or door, Ker Chunk could look out on the floor of the main rock, as he was just slightly above it. So there he was, high and dry, wedged in like a raisin in a cake, and wriggle and twist and wriggle all he might, Ker Chunk could not get out. He set up a terribly loud cry of "Kashoot! Kashoot!" which meant "Take me out! Take me out!" But no one dared go near him, and so there he stayed and all night long kept up the cry of "Kashoot! Kashoot! Take me out! Take me out!" But all the big frogs and the little frogs passed him by, taking no notice of his angry calls. The great frogs perched on the edge of the pond, and sang a loud chorus. Some little old men frogs boomed, "Pat go druck! Pat go druck! Pat go druck!" Others sang a famous croak of "Breck ek ex co ax co ax! Breck ek ex co ax co ax!" Others shrilled, "Creek come, creek! Creek come, creek! Creek come, creek!" Old women frogs moaned, "Wo come creel! Wo come creel! Wo come creel!" Whole troops of little ones cried, "We weel! We weel! We weel!" All night long the queer medley went sounding around the pond, and all that time Ker Chunk kept calling, "Go shoot! Go shoot! Take me out! Take me out!" At length Ker Chunk got tired. He folded away his clammy legs, let fall his round spotted head, closed his little goggle eyes, and went to sleep. Then the rest forgot him, and the next day, as he was too weak to cry out, they left him in the rock. The next day after Ker Chunk had been pushed into the cleft in the rock, he found himself very hungry. Oh, very hungry indeed. Had he been down by the pond, he could have found bugs and little insects in plenty, that with his long, snappy tongue he could have whisked into his mouth, and down his throat in a twinkling, but wedged in the rock he had called himself hoarse. Now, as he noticed how faint he felt after his nap, he thrust his head out of his tiny door and sensibly set himself to watching, just watching. Pretty soon a lazy bumblebee came by, singing "Bee-zee, bee-zee," and snap! Down Froggy's throat he went quicker than a wink, and without being hurt a bit. Then came a great blue fly that went by, buzz, buzz, and he, too, was snapped up in a trice. The sunshine was very bright that morning. All kinds of small creatures were out and about, and over by the great rocks near the water flew the insects, and out went Ker Chunk's tongue until he could not swallow another atom. Then, after the day was nearly gone, came Madam Frog, his mother, to pull Ker Chunk out from the rock, when lo! so swollen was he with different kinds of food that, tug as she might, the mother could not get him through the little door. Now, you must know that the skin of a frog is full of little glands, which means there are small, fleshy spots all over them, looking like warts, but they are really tiny cells that are filled with something like thick water, and there are several layers of skin on their tough little bodies. They take their food alive; that is, they catch such things as worms, insects, and bugs into their mouths as they crawl or fly about. And as it is said that a full grown frog has as many as 40 or 50 little teeth in the upper jaw, they can probably kill in an instant what they catch in the way of food. So Ker Chunk had squatted inside his tiny door with his head thrust out, catching and swallowing, and catching and swallowing, until all the little glands of his skin were swollen and puffy, and his small frog body was rounded out like a ball, and do her best, Mother Frog could not draw him through the cleft, nor could he squeeze himself through either. So Madame, the mother, told Ker Chunk that if he wanted to leave the rock and get down opposite by the pond again, he must do without food and live on air only for 2 or 3 days, as a frog is well able to do. And Ker Chunk tried and tried, but did not try long enough at a time. He would go without a single bug or plump young grasshopper for a day or so, then along would come a nice fat buzz buzz, or rattling young locust. Out would go Ker Chunk's long, swift tongue, and that would be the last of buzz buzz and whiz whiz. So the weeks went by. The sweet springtime when Ker Chunk was a little boy frog rolled away. Summer came, and it was no longer a small boy frog, but a big, puffy fellow with goggly eyes and a knowing face, that was fixed so firmly in the rock that it was not at all likely now he would ever get out again. And this was how Ker Chunk became the Rock Frog. If you wonder how he could grow so large in so small a space, it must be explained that although the door, or opening, through which Ker Chunk's mother pushed him, was very small, yet the chamber in which he found himself was of some size, and leading out of the first one was still another room in the rock larger than the first one. Neither were very large, even after Ker Chunk grew into a fine, portly frog. He had plenty of room in which to move about comfortably. Here he dreamed and dreamed, and looking out from his safe retreat, he learned a great many things even while quite young. A few years went by, during which the Rock Frog would thrust his head out of his tiny door, in pleasant weather, watch what was going on over at the pond, study the stars at night, and so grow wiser and wiser all the time. During the winter he would make a brown knot of himself in his inner room, and sleep until the spring calls would waken him. Then, at the call of Ker chunk, Ker chunk, from the middle of the rock, other frogs would hop and leap up the rocky sides and to the door of the Rock Frog's cells. Here he would talk to them in frog language, give the little froglings good advice, and show so much wisdom with the older frogs, telling them of strange signs he had learned about the earth, the water, the rocks, and the sky, that not only little froggies, but big croakers would go to him for knowledge or counsel. After a while, when a question would come up that they could not seem to settle among themselves, the cry would arise, "Let's go to the Rock Frog! Let us go to the Rock Frog! He can tell us what to do." And this was how the frogs themselves came to give Ker Chunk the name of the Rock Frog. Then once a strange bullfrog, a great bouncing fellow with a croak like a bass drum, calling "Boom a room room room, boom a room room room," came over from some marshlands, and fixing himself on the best perch for piping and diving, would not let any of the Long Pond frogs come near him. This made the frogs who had lived all their lives on the borders of the pond or in it very angry. "What should we do?" they asked, swelling with vexation at such haughty, impertinent airs. Then some of them cried, "Let's go to the Rock Frog, and see what he will advise." So off to Ker Chunk and his rocky home they started in long leaps, and told their story, half choking with wrath at thoughts of the proud creature that they felt had driven them away. The Rock Frog swallowed and swallowed a number of times after hearing what they had to say, and then it grew very quiet. He replied: "There is a very simple way to treat old Mr. Boom a Room, that will soon bring him to his senses." Ker Chunk winked solemnly, swallowed again, and then went on. "A few nights ago a party of sparrows came twittering to the rock. They did not see me, but they began quarreling over something. Pretty soon I saw that one of their number wanted to have more than half the platform of the rock to himself, and make the others listen to his chattering tongue. And a very cunning thing the rest of the sparrows did. After whispering together in bird language, away flew one of them, soon returning with a fine, crisp grasshopper in its bill. This it gave to the proud, selfish sparrow, and while my lord was feasting on the grasshopper, away flew all the other sparrows. When Mr. Greedy looked up, there he was with all the rock to himself, not another sparrow in sight, not a single bird to listen to his voice. He muttered and scolded, but his tail feathers hung down, and a more shamed, crestfallen looking bird you would not wish to see. Now my advice is, don't go back to the pond. Let this Boom a Room have it all to himself, but go, one of you, slyly to the other end of the pond, and tell the frogs there that if one Mr. Boom a Room 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 comes around, with a loud voice, wanting all to listen to him, and taking the best place he can find, to just hop quietly over to the rock and leave him alone in his glory." And that was what the frogs did. Those that were already on the rock stayed there, and soon another large company of frogs came hopping along. But the frog who carried Ker Chunk's message lingered to see how things would come out. And sure enough, when the smart Boom a Room looked around and found himself alone, he went puffing and blowing to the other end of Long Pond, and he had scarcely more than taken the best place he could find there and began booming again than he found himself all alone for the second time. "What rude creatures these Long Pond frogs are!" he panted. "I never want to visit them again." And full of rage he started off for his own marsh. The frog that had lingered heard the spunky speech of Boom a Room, and repeated it to the great crowd of frogs on and around the rock. They laughed in a froggy way, but the Rock Frog said: "Always give a frog that wants to swell and make a great fellow of himself all the room he wants. Give him all the room there is, and he will soon be glad to hop off and think things over by himself." And so wise were Ker Chunk's words, and so well did his plan work, that the frogs began to call him Judge Ker Chunk. So now you know both how he got his name of the Rock Frog, and how he came to be called Judge Ker Chunk. End of chapter 1. Recording by Linda Marie Nielsen, Vancouver, BC. Chapter 2 of the Rock Frog. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Linda Marie Nielsen, Vancouver, BC. The Rock Frog by Harriet Anna Cheever. Boom a Room's Ride. But the Long Pond frogs had not seen the last of Boom a Room. The truth was, he was kind of a frog king at Great Marsh, a place where dwelt so many frogs that at nightfall their chorus could be heard a long way off. And Boom a Room was a very useful fellow in the marsh where he belonged. He had taught the whole schools of frogs to dive, to catch insects, to hide quickly when there was danger, and to curl away for the winter when frost began to show white across the fields, and to nip the meadow grass. For did you think the froggies all shriveled up and died when the cold weather came? Oh, by no means. They find places under stones, at roots of trees, and largely under the mosses by the ponds, where, down rather deep, in strange little hollows, they get half frozen in, and there they live until the softer air begins creeping along the earth, and the frost disappears. Then, as soon as the air gets soft and warm, and there is a smell of spring in the air, there comes a peeping and a piping all along by the watercourses, and the people cry, "Oh, the spring has come, the spring has come." We hear the frogs singing in the damp places, by the puddles and the ponds. Now, how old do you suppose Boom a Room was? Well, we can't tell, but he might have been a very aged old frog, for it is thought that frogs sometimes live a great many years. Now, again, some frogs, like some boys or men, could be praised and made a great deal of, and yet not grow proud and put on silly airs, and begin to think that every one must stand aside for them. And then there are boys and men who really know a great deal, who, when they find people are beginning to look up to them, grow vain and think too much of themselves, and after a while need a lesson that will put down their self love and foolish pride. And it was true that Boom a Room had been followed about by other frogs, praised and looked up to, until he found that they were making of him a kind of frog king, and that was a little too much for him to bear sensibly. So the time came when he wished to air his greatness, and he thought he would leap and leap until he travelled from his own marsh lands over to Long Pond, find the best place for making his deep voice heard, and make the Long Pond frogs stand around in wonder and admiration.
Oh, how angry he was when he found that they had all quietly gone and left him. He sprang forward in great jumps, booming and growling so angrily that, when he reached the marsh, out came the frogs, big frogs, little frogs, all kinds of frogs, to see what had put their king into such a rage. And, in frog language, he told how, while he was puffing and drumming and booming to let them know he was around, some of the Long Pond frogs seemed to think he was taking up too much room and singing too loud, and when he let them know he should take all the room he wanted and sing as loudly as he pleased, it grew so quiet he thought they were struck dumb at his manner and his wonderful voice. Then he went on with his story. But when I looked around, there wasn't any other frog to be seen. I thought to myself, oh, they have gone to the other end of the pond, the better to hear my wonderful voice, and perhaps, too, they are preparing for me a little feast. So over to the other end of the pond I went, and lo, not a frog to be seen. Did ever a decent frog hear of such manners? They had all gone, and left me alone with Long Pond. What if I did want a wide space to myself? What if I did push one or two little ninny frogs aside that wanted to come too near a fine fellow like myself? What if I was bound to get their respectful attention? Will I stand such treatment? No. I will find some of those Long Pond frogs and tell them what I think of their rude, miserable behavior. Where can I find some of their chiefs? Does any one know? I can tell, piped a brisk young frog, where they have a judge over there called Judge Ker Chunk. They think he is very wise, and, as he lives in a rock that has two chambers in it he cannot get out of, he also is called the Rock Frog. They go to him about everything they want to know, and he can always help and advise them. Then over to this Rock Frog I go at once, cried Boom a Room, and let him know how I have been treated. Judge Ker Chunk was having a nice nap, as it was growing dusky the next even, when the Marsh King came hopping over toward Long Pond. He was pretty quiet, as frogs generally are when going from place to place, but as he was muttering in low tones to himself as he hopped, we may learn something of his frame of mind by listening to his words. Yes, I must keep still on the road. Last night, in my anger, I boomed all the way home, a very dangerous thing to do, because there are no friendly ponds at every step, into one of which I could plunge, if a boy or an air giant came along. I could hide under a stone or a broad leaf in an instant should I see one of those dangers in time, and not a creature of that kind need know I am around if I keep my tongue still, while many a snap may be made at me if my rich boom was heard along the road. It was beginning to be noisy down by the pond, and Judge Ker Chunk could not have dozed much longer, when right by his door rang out a loud call that made him jump. Boom a room, room, room. Boom a room, room, room. The voice which called was so harsh and deep that the Rock Frog said to himself, let me go and attend to the frog that has so commanding a voice. It cannot be a Long Ponder, for had I ever heard such a croak before, I should surely remember it. When Judge Ker Chunk appeared at the door of his rocky house, he saw an enormous frog, puffing and blowing and swallowing and muttering, yet scarcely knowing what to say. He was thinking how best to address such a fellow, when Boom a Room, in hoarse tones, began telling his own story, and so loud grew his voice that the frogs on the banks of Long Pond said to each other, "Oh, it must be that our judge is in danger. What if that great puffy Boom a Room has found him, and is scolding at him? He cannot get at him, for he could never get through the rock door, but we cannot let the creature scold in such a fashion. Come, let us go and drive him away." So a large company of frogs started for the rock, when all of a sudden back they leaped, as if crazy, for the edge of the pond. In fact, so fast they went that one tumbled over the other in their scratching haste to reach the water. A few hid under great stones that promised safe shelter. Others gave surprising leaps toward broad leaves that hid them. Others plunged at once into the water, but kept near the bank, where it was murky and could not be seen through. In a moment, from the first hint of fright, not a frog was to be seen between Long Pond and the great rock, and all the frogs that had been perched along the edge of the stream had also disappeared. What could have frightened them so? Now, when boys, birds, animals, or insects grow very angry and begin to talk in loud, spiteful voices, they forget everything else, and even when others try to warn them of danger, they will not listen. And as Boom a Room was sending his loud voice through the evening air, Ker Chunk tried to silence him and make him hold his peace. The Rock Frog hopped about, crying out in his own tongue, "Take care! Take care! Hide! Hide!" Ah, it was no use. Boom a Room would not listen, but went hollering on, saying he would pay the Long Pond frogs for their sly, rude ways, when all at once there came a flapping of mighty wings, a shadow seemed to darken half the rock, a wild swoop, a clutch, and Boom a Room was gone! Gone far up into the air, held in the talons or claws of a great bald eagle. Judge Ker Chunk trembled all over as he scrambled into his inner room. "Now see what comes of giving way to anger and passion!" he cried. I tried my best to raise my voice above his, but in vain. The louder I croaked, the deeper was his boom, and when in dread and fear I hopped about as if gone wild, the angry marsh frog only raised his hoarse cry all the louder, letting the eagle know all the better exactly where to find him. Oh dear! Oh dear! We frogs grow very wise in catching at signs of danger, and understanding them. I saw the shadow flash over the water, and feared what it might mean. Boom a Room would have seen and known the danger, too, had it not been for his great rage. Even through his din I noticed that not another frog was piping. Alas! He was filling the air with such a noise, like the deep drums that the creatures called men use, that he did not notice the silence, nor that every frog in sight, a moment before, had disappeared. I would have saved the fine great frog that was in such a tempest of anger if I could, but he simply would not let me. He may escape. I hope he will. But he is almost sure to be borne to some deep nest over the water and be snapped down the eagle's throat in an instant of time. Yes, I hope he will get away, but what a warning to all creatures not to get so wild with temper that they will not listen to a warning voice, or to notice the signs that every bright froggy knows so well. The Rock Frog was quiet a moment, then spoke again. Now here I am, shut away from the rest of the world, and only able to put my head out at my door, see across the pond, up in the sky a little way, and as far as my eyesight will go across the sides of a rock. But if I am cut off from a great deal I might enjoy, I also am entirely safe from many dangers. No eagle could pull me out of my two cozy chambers. No boy could put his foot on me. I can thrust my head from the door, and, as frogs never have to drink, I can draw into my skin all the moisture I need. Plenty of insects buzz by my door. Many come in. Often I am brought some nice tidbit by kind friends. So I am always well fed. Judge Ker Chunk's eyes grew more round and stuck out a little more than usual, as he added, even a frog that is a judge is not wise enough to understand some things. Yet I do wonder who knows everything, and makes us safe and well off in one way when other comforts fly away and take care of us all. Yes, who can it be? End of chapter 2. Recording by Linda Marie Nielsen, Vancouver, BC.
Chapter 3 of the Rock Frog. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Linda Marie Nielsen, Vancouver, BC. The Rock Frog by Harriet Anna Cheever. The Marsh Frog. Judge Ker Chunk, peeping from his open door, saw first one little round head, then another, come cautiously out of the water, yet it was some time before the boldest frog dared raise himself to the edge of the pond. But when the water showed no shadow, when there was no whir in the air, and across the way the Rock Frog was seen stretching out his head for a good look around, they came, slowly at first, then in greater numbers, towards the rock. Several crept from under stones or hopped from under dark leaves, and soon Judge Ker Chunk had a large company of pipers bobbing in front of his chambers, all peeping forth their fear of what had happened to the smart man frog from the marsh. We had no chance to warn him, they cried. The air giant came so swiftly it was all we could do to look out for our own lives and scud for safety to the nearest shelter of water, leaf, or stone. I warned him, or rather tried to, answered the Rock Frog, but in his noisy, swelling rage he had no ears with which to hear, and now he, perhaps, will never drum more. At that a whole chorus of frogs took up the words, "Never drum more, never drum more, never drum more." It was a cry of sorrow, a lament for the foolish frog who had left them in such a dreadful hurry. A gentleman who was driving out with a lady in the cool of the day stopped the horse to listen to the queer wail of the frogs. They were not afraid of the carriage nor the people. They were not the kind of objects that often harmed them, and the gentleman said to the lady, "What a strange sound the frogs are making to night. It seems solemn, as if they were mourning over something. Listen. What a queer note." And louder than before, the cry arose from a great bunch of frogs on the rock. "Never drum more, never drum more, never drum more." The frogs farther in on shore wondered what had happened, and when the others left the rock they came in turn, to be told what the eagle had done. Then the whole multitude by the water took up the chorus, and all night long there rang from the region of Long Pond the dull croak
that told all the frogs round of the sad fate of poor Boom a Room. In the meantime the marsh frogs wondered what had become of their king. He had been expected to lead off in a grand hop, or dance, that was to be given the next night, and when he did not appear to make any plans there were loud calls for the marsh king. By noon the frogs grew still more restless, and hopped here and there searching for the active, knowing fellow that could always help and direct them. Then the pert young frog that had told Boom a Room about Judge Ker Chunk croaked out, "Ah, it was yesterday that our king was very angry with the frogs at Long Pond. You remember his telling that, when he went over there expecting to be treated with great respect, every froggy went away and left him by himself. Then I told him of the judge they have, that lives in a rock, and he said he would see him, and make a noise about the way in which he had been used." "Let us go and find the marsh king," cried several voices at once, and so it was agreed that as soon as the sun sunk down behind the hills they would form a company and march forth to find Boom a Room, their king. It was growing dark when the frogs on Long Pond edge, in the puddles down deep by the grassy roadside, were beginning to tune their little fiddles for the night's songs. All at once they heard the Rock Frog cry loudly, "Clock a clock, clock a clock, clock a clock." Now this, it was well known, was the cry that the Rock Frog was to send forth when he wanted assistance, or that his friends should come to him. As long as he sat before his doorway and merely croaked "Ker chunk, ker chunk," no special notice was taken of it. But as soon as he cried "Clock a chalk, clock a chalk, clock a chalk," it meant, "I want you, I want you." "Hark!" cried one of the frogs, "the judge is calling us." And, as they listened, sure enough, they heard plainly the cry which meant, "I want you, I want you." In a moment the rock was dark with frogs, who squatted about, some close to the hole or door, to see what Judge Ker Chunk might want or need. He croaked in low, muttering tones, "Listen! From my high perch here on the rock I hear sounds from afar that are fast coming near. Some strange frogs are on their way toward the pond. It may be that some of the marsh frogs are coming to look for their chief. If that is the case, let us be ready." Scarcely had the words been spoken when the great squad of frogs were seen hopping along in orderly fashion from the direction of the marsh, and now making straight for the rock. "What shall you do?" asked the big bullfrog of Judge Ker Chunk. "I shall tell the truth and not get angry," replied the judge. The marsh frogs had chosen a fine great speckled fellow to speak for them, and the Long Ponders made way for the Marshers, as they hopped up the sides of the rock and asked for Judge Ker Chunk. The Marshers were very polite in their speech, and, as the Rock Frog told just what had happened to their chief, the damp little fellows from the marsh had to confess that their leader had made a great mistake in getting angry, and that, alas, it was his own fault that he had refused to listen to warning words, and had been so cruelly snapped away. "He was indeed a good king," piped one. "No doubt," answered the Rock Frog kindly, and a whole chorus of Long Ponders took up the cry, "No doubt, no doubt, no doubt." "He taught us many useful things," said another. "No doubt," again answered Judge Ker Chunk, and all through the woods rang the loud agreement from the Long Ponders, "No doubt, no doubt, no doubt." The next question was not soon answered. "Now what are we to do?" asked the appointed speaker from the marsh. "We are very forlorn at missing our good king from our marshy home. We know how little hope there is for any creature that is once grabbed in the great talons of our worst air giant, the eagle, but once in a while it happens that something escapes him. Yet how shall we know? Or what can we do? The frogs from the pond and the frogs from the marsh look at each other. They swell out their breasts, and swallowed, till it would seem their throats must have ached. Then Judge Ker Chunk croaked slowly and honestly: "I will do what I should want your king to do for me had I been the one clutched up by the air giant. If in any way I can help him, I will. I think all the Long Pond frogs will do the same. If we can, we will help to get Boom a Room home." As the Rock Frog looked around to see what the Long Ponders would say, they broke into a roaring echo: "Get Boom a Room home! Get Boom a Room home! Get Boom a Room home!" The Marshers nodded their thanks, for they could not make their croakings heard, so mighty was the boom of the Long Ponders. Off they hopped, seeming a little more cheerful than when they came, and the same gentleman who had been out driving the evening before, happened to again pass by with this lady, said, with a laugh: "I do believe the frogs in this region are trying to get some poor fellow, or some wilful, or some unfortunate fellow home. Only hear what a strange cry they are sending forth." He stopped the horse again, and the lady laughed too, as from pond edge, mud puddle, and rock came the solemn croak: "Get Boom a Room home! Get Boom a Room home! Get Boom a Room home!" "Poor little fellows!" exclaimed the lady. "I do hope they will get Mr. Boom a Room home." As is the habit of the frog to keep up through the night any cry he starts in the evening, all the long hours while the moon was climbing higher and higher in the sky, and while the stars were twinkling and blinking in the deep blue overhead, casting bright gleams along the pond, the frogs carried out their promise over and over to try to get Boom a Room home again. Then, when the moon went down, the stars grew pale and gleamed the great, glorious sun. The frogs grew silent and sank to rest. End of chapter 3. Recording by Linda Marie Nielsen, Vancouver, BC.
Chapter 4 of the Rock Frog. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Linda Marie Nielsen, Vancouver, BC. The Rock Frog by Harriet Anna Cheever. The Wounded Air Giant. All was quiet along the pond and meadows, so far as the frogs were concerned, until after the noon hour. Then just a few froggies, soon followed by others, peeped with round eyes from soft mud beds, clumps of moist moss, and damp masses of leaves. They kept very still as the twittering notes of the birds seemed to change to chirps of fear, and there was a strange commotion and a great scurrying in the trees far over their heads. They knew nothing of what it meant, until all at once there was a whizzing sound, a whir, a fall, and oh dear, dear, flip flop came a great air giant, settling with a crash directly on the rock, and close before the door of Judge Ker Chunk's chambers. Not a frog moved except to tremble like a leaf. They would not even hop to cover until the creature moved again. After a time, one whispered in the lowest of croaks: "Let us be thankful it cannot get at our Rock Frog." "It lies so still," came in another whispered croak. "Perhaps it could harm none of us." "Still," piped softly a third. Can't you hear the queer sound it is keeping up? I'm sure I wouldn't go near it for the world." "Oh, nor I, nor I," cried many a soft frog voice. An hour passed away. The frogs kept watching anxiously, wondering what the Rock Frog would do. Suddenly they were amazed at hearing the loud cry: "Clook a clook, clook a clook." "Oh, oh!" they exclaimed. "Judge Ker Chunk is calling us to him. What can he be thinking of? Does he suppose we will go near that air giant that would snap us up quicker than a flash?" "And do you suppose," asked Father Hind Legs, an old frog who often gave good advice to younger ones, "that our Rock Frog would put any of our lives in danger?" "Clook a clook, clook a clook," came from the rock more loudly than before. "I go to see what is wanted," said Father Hind Legs. "Follow me who choose." As he hopped away, several of the older, larger frogs joined him. The air giant lay perfectly still as they leaped to the rock, yet wide open were his shining dark eyes, and, what was more, he was blinking steadily. The frogs kept close together and stopped short at the top of the rock. Such a terrible enemy to draw near to! But Judge Ker Chunk called out cheerily: "Do not be afraid. The hawk cannot move until we do something for his bruised wing." "We?" croaked the frogs in surprised echo. "Yes, we," answered the Rock Frog. "I have made our great enemy, the hawk, understand me. He has a wing severely wounded, and until he is helped and the wing is healed he cannot fly or even flop, he is so weak. Yet I think that, with care, he can soon be in the air again. We have talked long together, for I would not call you until it was plain I could do so with safety. Now the hawk promises to be our friend and to serve us, if we will serve him. Animals are very true to each other when once they promise friendship, I find. The hawk thinks he might be able to find Boom a Room, were he determined to. He tells me that he has an idea that he knows the very eagle that snatched him up, and that he knows where his nest is well. Night before last he met an eagle with something held in his talons. It is a monster fellow that enjoys getting together a number of different creatures and keeping them in his nest to amuse himself with. Then, once in a while he has a great party, calls his friends together from far and near, shows the creatures that he has captured, and capers and revels the whole night long. And although a hawk does not usually fly as high as an eagle, yet this one promises on his honor that, if we will but help him now, he will not only never harm a Long Pond frog, but he will do his best to find Boom a Room, and will, if possible, bring him to me on this my rock." Yet the frogs hung back. "The eagle," they said, "has ever been our greatest enemy, and next to him, the one most dreaded has been the hawk. How can we feel sure that he will do us no harm?" "My children," said the Rock Frog, "there are times when we must learn to trust each other. I have twice fed the hawk as he lay close to my den. First a fat grasshopper landed on the sill of my door, which I snapped up and tossed into his bill. Then a locust droned along. I caught him too, stretching out my head to blow it into the beak of the hawk. Both times he could have snapped at me had he tried, but I was not afraid to trust him. Will you not help a creature that is in distress? Can you believe that promises made in hours of trouble will be kept? See, I am not afraid to put my head close to the beak of the hawk." The Rock Frog thrust his head and neck far out from the door, where in very truth the hawk could have grabbed him and had he chosen. Seeing Ker Chunk's trust and courage, Father Hindlegs hopped bravely up, followed as before by several mates, and carefully pushing the hurt wing to one side saw that something must be done at once, if it were ever to heal. The Rock Frog told them what to do. First they spread wide the helpless wing, that the cooling air might reach and soothe it. Even that seemed to give relief. They next hopped over to the pond, and taking the widest strips of grass they could find, pawed them into the soft mud, then taking the ends in their mouths, hurried back to the rock where Father Hindlegs laid them one by one on the sore spot. This must have been painful, but the hawk seemed to know that it would also be healing. Animals, birds, and insects often show a great deal of pluck when suffering, and the hawk appeared to understand that the frogs were only friendly and kind in placing the cool, sticky grass on its wounded wing. Very helpless the air giant was indeed. It could not stir with that drooping, painful wing, even to snap at grasshoppers, spiders, or the great blue flies that went buzzing by. But strange as it may seem, the Long Pond frogs kept the wild bird alive. After once treating the wing, they let it alone. Their instincts, which answers with creatures of the air, the field, and the water, for a mind, told them that nature, kind nature, the ablest, most willing nurse in the world, would do the rest, after the healing mud and cooling air had done their work. It took a great deal to feed the air giant. Whole families of grasshoppers, locusts, and beetles would disappear down its throat, and still it would be ready for more. But the frogs found it so strange a thing to go near what usually was such a terror, that it became a kind of charm to keep hopping up and dropping food into the great beak. At night the dew moistened its tongue, but it drank in eagerly the drops it could catch during a shower. One day when the frogs went to feed it, the air giant was standing on its claws instead of lying on one side. But so well acquainted and fearless they had become that they hopped cheerily alongside. All at once the hawk caught a great buzzing bottlefly in its beak. This showed it could now feed itself. Then it also dipped its bill into a hollow in the rock, drinking a few drops of water from it. "I think," said Judge Ker Chunk, "that our friend will soon be able to fly. He has flapped his wings slowly up and down, as if to try it, and although it is pretty stiff yet, it certainly must be healed." For a day or two more the frogs hopped around and about the hawk, showing they were not in the least afraid of him, and wondering what the marsh frogs would think, should they see such an amazing sight as a lot of frogs going right up to an air giant. Then one morning, when they leaped to the rock, the giant was gone. "He went at midnight," said Judge Ker Chunk, "but spread his wings so carefully you could not have heard him. He went first only across to the lowest limb of a tree. There he rested some time. Then he went across to another tree a little higher up. There he rested a long time. Then very slowly he soared away again, and that time beyond my sight. But just before he went," continued the Rock Frog, "he did something that would have frightened you almost to death had you seen it. I was scared for a moment, but very quickly I knew what he was about. He took my head in his beak and pulled and pulled and pulled, yet it was done in so gentle a way as not to hurt at all. In his husky croak he made me to understand he hoped to be able to pull me from the rock. Yet he was afraid that, if he asked permission, I would be alarmed, and say, 'No, oh, no, I cannot let you try.' So he set to work without my leave, knowing he would not hurt me. He said I had spoken a good word for him, and set an example of trusting him,
and you all had been so kind, he wanted, if possible, to set me free." The Rock Frog grew silent, and it was quiet all around until he added, in a low voice, "The air giant said it was certain that I never could be pulled from my rocky home." It was quiet again, until a smart young spotted froggy asked, "Would you care to get out of the rock if you could? It is a very safe place, and we all come to see you." The frogs listened to hear what reply the judge would make. "Ah," he said, "freedom is sweet. Had any of you ever been shut up as I have, even in ever so safe a place, for just a few months or weeks, you would never ask that question, or wonder what would be my reply. Freedom is sweet. It is the sweetest thing in the world that I know of. It is good to be safe, but I would rather risk many dangers than never be able to hop about except from one little space to another. It is a great thing that I can look across to the pond and up to a piece of the sky, but what are those little peeps to being out in the wild meadows, tuning my fiddle by the pond, plunging into the cool, delightful water, seeing all the sights, and hearing the sounds that come from all around? Freedom is a great, great word. How thankful poor old Boom a Room will be if he ever gets his freedom again," said Father Hind Legs. "I hope," said Judge Ker Chunk, "it will be a great and good thing, both for the Long Ponders and the Marshers, if he does. I fear there has always been a bad feeling between the two. Now, should the one they call the King of the Marsh Frogs be set free, and restored to them through the wish of the Long Pond frogs, it should surely be the beginning of great friendliness and peace between the tribes. For that reason, as well as for Boom a Room's sake, I greatly hope he will be found and rescued." "So do I," said Father Hind Legs. "So do we all," piped a whole army of frogs. And the region of Long Pond sounded all night to an unbroken chorus of "Do we all, do we all, do we all." End of chapter 4. Recording by Linda Marie Nielsen, Vancouver, BC. Chapter 5 of the Rock Frog. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Linda Marie Nielsen, Vancouver, BC. The Rock Frog by Harriet Anna Cheever. The Eagle's Nest. A few days and nights passed, and no sign was seen of the air giant that the Long Pond frogs had cared for. "You must be prudent," advised Judge Ker Chunk. "Other air giants are likely to be winging along the sky beside the one that vowed to keep the peace with us." Toward evening of the second day after the hawk had flown away, the cry rang out again. "Clock a clock! Clock a clock!" Very soon the frogs were crowding all along the top and sides of the rock before Judge Ker Chunk's door. "I heard a squad of frogs coming again," said the Rock Frog, "and from toward the marsh. Shall we tell them about the air giant and what he promised as to their king?" It was agreed that it would be quite the thing to let the Marshers know that the Long Ponders had been friendly in trying to get help for Boom a Room, and the marsh frogs at once grew friendly themselves on hearing it, and declared there should be no more trouble or jealousies between the two tribes, even if Boom a Room did not return to them. Then they scrambled away as if feeling still more hopeful than after their first visit, and their croakings took on a more cheerful sound. The next night, at midnight, when a frog chorus was in full blast, a great shadow darkened the pond, wide wings flapped, and every frog disappeared, the usual fright coming back as long as they did not know what dread bird it might be that was clouding the moonlight. But in another instant came the well known call, "Clock a clock, clock a clock, clock a clock," and there on the rock was an air giant that surely must be their friend. But they need not have been afraid, for the hawk remained only a moment, then soared away, up, up into the blue heavens, far and far away. As Father Hindlegs, who could take surprising leaps, reached the top of the rock, his little round eyes saw at once that the King of the Marshes, Boom a Room, was squatting directly in front of Judge Ker Chunk's door, his throat pumping, his eyes staring, his breast heaving, and his whole appearance saying, "Here I am again. Oh, what luck!" Yet it took but a glance to see the Marsh King was too choked up to speak. He cast glances around that were full of fright, and seemed begging for protection and kindness. And come to find out, he did not know at all how it was that he came to find himself back at the Rock Frog's door. So it had to be explained. The long story had to be told, how the marsh frogs called to find out if possible what had become of their king, how the air giant, the hawk, had been hurt, and what it had promised. "Now you must tell us all about your strange and dangerous trip," said the Rock Frog. "We know you must want to get back to your own tribe, but we must hear what you have seen during the week that has gone, since we saw you carried away. I tried to warn you of your danger, I did indeed, but alas! your voice boomed so loud and deep I could not make you hear." "I will surely tell the strange exciting story of what I have seen and heard since the moment I was seized and carried away," said Boom a Room; "but let me begin at the beginning so you will understand all about it." He waited a few moments while a multitude of frogs piled themselves all over the rock, on top, at the sides, everywhere within sound of his voice. In fact, so many of them were there that the ground for some distance beyond the rock was dark with little squatting figures. But Boom a Room, although feeling rather weak, said he would speak loudly enough for them all to hear. As it grew quiet, the marsh frog, who was perched close beside the rock frog, began his story. "I do indeed want to see the good little men, the fat little men, the kind little men, the smart little men of the marsh frogs, but it is through the kindness and thoughtfulness and forgiveness of the Rock Frog and the Long Ponders that I am here to night, and you shall be the first to hear my story." And first, I knew on the instant what had befallen me when I felt the talons of the eagle closing over my body. I had talked too loud, had croaked down every one else, and not being able to see or hear any danger signs, I had been swooped up by an air giant, and the worst one of all, the eagle. Now, perhaps you think it was very painful being carried in claws high into the air. Not at all. I was held in what formed a comfortable hollow, as high up and far away flew the eagle. In fact, I was in a kind of cage, one I could not get out of, but could peep through, and full of fear as I was, it was a very alluring thing to look down, down, down upon sights I had never dreamed of before. I saw the tops of buildings, could see the great things we often hear, and the men call bells, hanging in the steeples, and after a few minutes, that seemed like hours to me, we were over the tops of trees, and I could see the little birds safe in their nests. Oh, I wished I were a leaf, a twig, anything that was not alive and could not feel. But up, up we went until the air for me was so thin
I opened my mouth to breathe the easier, and then we were over the water, and there, on a little point of rock that hung over the deep blue sea, was a great nest, into one corner of which I was dropped and left to myself. In a moment I saw that another great frog, quite as large as I am, was in an opposite corner of the nest, but it was of a different kind and very green, with large warty blotches all over it. Then again there was a good sized, handsome lizard with bright colored spots all over its back. I thought it was pretending to be dead, it kept so still, but I had not seen then what a trap it was in. Next, my eye lighted on a baby duckling huddled in a far corner, looking so lonesome and homesick I really pitied it. And as for the brilliantly spotted lizard, I found it was under a network of roots and twine so skillfully crossed, recrossed, and fastened down that escape was impossible. The eagle had flown away directly after dropping me, as if quite sure that getting away was something out of the question. I began to examine the nest. It was a great place, looking to me as large as a room. It was so deep that I could see nothing from it but the sky above my head. The nest was made almost entirely of sticks, curiously plaited and braided, and small spaces filled in here and there with smaller sticks, and all made fast to the ledge with other sticks. The inside was fine, lined first with roots having fibers that made a kind of lacework, catching and holding in place the moss and grasses that made a soft and pleasant carpet on which to sit or lie. There were funny little bunchy places on which one could perch, and the sides were filled in with sticks and twigs, much like the floor. I at once felt a strong desire to catch my claws in the crevices at the sides, get to the top of the nest, and take a look around. If there was any way of escape I meant to make a bold snap at it. I thought the green blotchy fellow opposite had followed my eyes and knew my thoughts, for I declare he grinned, yes, grinned, stretched his spit of a mouth, and seemed to say, "Let's see you try it. Come now, try it, do." My next thought was, that no matter how vexed or provoked I might feel, I would not show temper or give way to anger again. Had not a fit of passion brought me to that prison? And if ever I wanted or hoped to get away, must I not make friends instead of enemies of my fellow prisoners, especially one of my own kind? So instead of swelling and swallowing, and puffing and blowing, I hopped over to the great green fellow, who really was fine enough looking, and said, "It appears we are in a bad fix." "Very bad indeed," he replied, with a leer. "No chance of getting away, I suppose," said I. "Do you see any?" he asked. "No," I said pleasantly but firmly. "Yet I am going to do my best to scratch up the sides of this nest, look around for myself, and see what I think of the prospect." "I would," said the green frog. "I've done it several times, but I haven't taken my flight yet." I turned without another word and began the hard task of climbing. The poor little duck, seeing me start, set up a sharp little squawk that seemed to say, "Take me too, take me too." In a moment I heard the other frog coming after me. Seeing I was bound to keep good nature, he inclined towards helping me somewhat. "Stick the fingers of your forelegs in the little openings," he said. "That will aid you." I took his advice, and after a long, tiresome scramble gained the top of the nest. The green frog was soon beside me. The nest was thick as well as deep, and had a wide rim all around the top that gave ample room on which to squat comfortably as we looked around uncomfortably, and croaked disconsolately. "Water, only water far below,
except for jagged rocks with picket like points that might pin a frog through if he struck on one, while leaping beyond them into the stream would be next to impossible. The moon was shining brightly, and far as the keen little eye of a frog could see, only water and rocky shores were below us. At one side was deep, deep drowning water. Yet for all the danger I could not help admiring the splendid outlook. I had never seen anything half so grand before. The moon made a glittering path across the great sea. Rocks rose here and there, and if land lay beyond them it was hidden from our sight. "How deep do you suppose the water is under us?" I asked the green frog. "I cannot tell," he replied, "but it must be very deep, and we could not fling ourselves beyond these rocks, no matter how hard we tried. Besides, you can see for yourself that the current at this point is swift and strong. A frog could not swim against it even where the water could be reached." "Have you been here long?" I asked. "More than a week," he replied. "And are still alive?" "Yes. I do not think the eagle catches us only for food. He and his mate seem to enjoy having strange company about them, and every little while they have a party of eagles in the nest, when the eagle prods and pokes us to make us dance and croak. The lizard turns all sorts of colors in the moonlight, and he pushes him until he crawls about under his netting in pretty lively fashion, so showing his fine spots." "Then the eagle has a mate?" "Oh, dear, yes, and a very fond couple they are, too. I think they are both very old and have lived together a great many years. They say they do." I began to see that the green frog was quite a knowing fellow, and so went on asking questions. "How old may the eagle be?" "I don't know, but it is told that they do live to be over 100 years old, and a pair of eagles will live together till one or the other of them dies." "Have they had many feasts since you were here?" "Two, and I think they will have another soon." "What do they feast upon chiefly?" "Fish. They are very fond of fish, and at this season catch a great many plump, fine ones. Perhaps you know that hawks from a high perch can see quite a distance under water. I have an idea that eagles can do the same. This enables them to sight a fish that is sporting under the surface of the sea, imagining itself perfectly safe. But down swoops the air giant, then out of sight he plunges under the wave, and up he comes, a wriggling fish in his beak. Seagulls are also a treat, and even a tiny pig will sometimes be borne squealing into the nest." "Where is his mate now?" I asked. "She has been gone since early morning, visiting, I think. As I said, I think a feast is coming before long, and she is off perhaps inviting the guests. Ha! Here he comes." And stopping never an instant, head over heels we went down into the nest, landing on our backs, and we were quietly squatting in our opposite corners when the eagle fluttered home. End of chapter 5. Recording by Linda Marie Nielsen, Vancouver, BC. Chapter 6 of the Rock Frog. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Linda Marie Nielsen, Vancouver, BC. The Rock Frog by Harriet Anna Cheever. The rest of Boom a Room's story. The bald eagle was a splendid fellow come to get a good look at him. As people measure, he was more than a yard long from his crown to the tip of his tail. They called him bald, or bareheaded, because his head is white, covered with white feathers, which gives him a bald appearance. His neck and tail feathers are also white. The rest of him, I should say, was a purplish black. Ah, but he was the hardy, fearless bird! He would look up at the sun without blinking, and would soar up, 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 so high that he would look like a mere speck in the sky. The flapping of his wide, strong wings could be heard from a distance. Dear me, and dear me, how dreadfully angry I must have been not to have heard the whir and sweep of those great pinions. He took no notice of us whatsoever as he pounced into the nest, but he appeared to need rest after being absent all night long. He hid his head partly under his wing, but I think slept also with head erect and bright eyes closed. Soon we heard the sound of other wings, and into the nest came the mate, not as large a bird as the man eagle, but a fine, handsome creature, with a bit of a goose in one claw that would never quack again, and a good sized fish in her beak. Well, the pair were at home but little of the time. The second night we climbed again, the green frog and I, to the rim of the nest, and took another look at the hopeless but splendid water view. "Can you think of any way to escape?" I asked. "Only one," was the reply. "And what is that? To jump and trust to reaching the shore?" "By no means. I saw one frog try it, but he never reached any shore." "How then?" "I do not want to be rude. I have learned that rudeness and unkindness do not pay, but I want to keep the secret to myself. I might tell it. Then a frog might try, and never see the sun again." He did not speak ungently, but as if he wished to keep silent as to his proposed plan of escape, and I thought it all right that he should, so said no more about it. But as I left him there, I shall always wonder if his plan was one that would serve him. The days went slowly by. We found food enough, as the eagles left many scraps about that we could pick up. Yet the nest was kept clean, and I sometimes felt that the eagles liked having creatures about that they would pick up the bits. And I became almost fond of the green frog. I found that he lived on the banks of a deep pool, into which he was in the habit of diving, then settling himself in the green slime close to it. He doubtless was of much importance in the place where he belonged, for he told of frog laws he had helped to make, and I found he knew about everything a frog is supposed to know, and noticed everything that was worth noticing, which generally makes either a frog or a boy bright and knowing. I told him all about our marsh frogs, also about the long ponders, and your wise judge, the rock frog. He paid attention to all I told him, and I think will not forget it. And he was perfectly right in thinking that another feast was at hand, for bits of fruit were stored in the nest day before yesterday, and bunches of grasshoppers and various kinds of bugs. Then yesterday morning several fishes were caught and left on the rocks below, and last night crabs and gulls were piled about as it grew dark. As it grew late, several strange eagles and a number of hawks came wheeling up to the nest. At first they did not seem to notice us, but the green frog croaked softly, just so I could hear him, that after a time we would be expected to dance on our hind legs, and wiggle about in a lively jig for the amusement of the company. After looking keenly about I began to notice the strange behavior of a large hawk that, instead of staying outside or circling around the nest, kept peering inside. He would blink first at me, then at the green frog, but seemed to watch me the closest. Then the strangest thing happened. You see, the poor little duckling that I had pitied from the first had a queer habit of cuddling close to me at night. This was very strange, for I belonged to a cold-blooded tribe that a little feathered creature would scarcely think of creeping up to, and a great frog sometimes snaps up a wee duck. But I suppose loneliness or homesickness makes us all do unusual things, and I somehow liked the feeling of that soft little thing that must have been snatched from its downy mother and the rest of the brood. All at once I felt sure that the hawk was going to swoop down and catch me up, and on the instant I grabbed the little duck that was hunched up close beside me, clutching him tightly in the webbed toes of a hind leg. Sure enough, before I could bid the green frog good bye or even think of it, the hawk made a dive and snatched at me, the duckling dangling down. I could hear its little legs softly click and clatter as they crossed and recrossed in the air, and we were off and away, whither bound I had not the least idea. But even in the claws of the hawk I saw a barnyard as we sped along, and an old duck nestling with a brood partly under her wing and partly huddled at her side. Opening wide my webbed foot, down dropped the duckling, and I heard a glad quack in the distance. So whether it was baby duck's own mother or not, no matter, it was sure of being mothered by its own kind, and its danger and homesickness were all over and done with. What joy! One thing I noticed as we bore onward. The hawk had an unusual way of flying, as if it limped, and went slightly sideways in its flight. The next thing I knew, I was in another nest in a pine grove, where the trees were so thick and so high that I had been in the middle of a tree. I could have seen nothing but branches, boughs, and green leaves. But the hawk's nest was far aloft in a tall tree that had no leaves, but only bare branches at the top. Such a peculiar nest! No moss, no grasses, no lining at all in the hollow. I was surprised to see how this troubled me, for tough as the body of a frog looks and really is, we yet are used to soft mud, or the spongy dampness of boggy places, and a bare bed of braided sticks is anything but soft or spongy. But this was last night, and now let me tell you how much a hawk knows. I think he went back to the eagle's feast, as it is not likely that the eagle saw him bear me away. It was done slyly and quickly. Now he had left me in that shallow nest. I could easily have made my way to the ground, and hopped until my home was reached. In some way I could have found it. But my lord the hawk had no notion of letting me get away, so he tucked my toes in between the sticks, and wove twigs in close network all around me, until I was in a complete cage, and could not possibly have worked my way out. He left a few roots and dried berries near me, and went on his way. I did not see him again until this noon. Of course I was dreadfully afraid of him, but, strange as it is, we do get used, in a way, even to being scared nearly out of our senses, and as the hawk did not act as if he meant to harm me, I began to wonder at his care, and to ask myself what he meant to do. I find that eagles and hawks are chiefly creatures of the darkness, for their nests are usually empty at night, except as they meet to feast or hold midnight revel. And yet, If it is a tender, tiny chicken, a plump baby goose, or a little duckling they have a mind to dine upon, they knew enough to go in the daytime for that kind of treat, and not when all such juicy atoms are safe beneath a mother's wing. Late this evening the hawk came home, unbound me, and took me in his claws, and after a long flight in his lame, uncertain way, dumped me on this rock. What a bird of honor is he! I know now that an injured wing, probably not yet quite sound, caused his imperfect zigzag flight. And I can see that the reason he did not bring me back last night was because he wanted to return to the eagle's nest, and knew that he could not fly so far at one time. So now here I am, brought back by a grateful, faithful bird, who has acted like a prince in carrying out a promise made in a time of trouble, and I promise in turn that the strange, hard lesson I have learned shall last me as long as I live. Three good things I am sure will come of what happened to me. First, I shall not let my boom of a voice rise in temper again so far above other sounds that a great air giant can flap its wings directly over my head and I do not hear it. Second, I have discovered that where we proudly and foolishly set our wills to getting something that we are determined to have, we may get it, but at a cost that would make us thankful to do without it rather than pay such a price. I was bound that the Long Pond frogs should keep still and listen to my voice. And listen you had to for a little while, whether you would or no. Now you have listened again with kind attention. But think of the frights I have had, and the dangers I have faced, since first I tried to make you hear my booming voice. The third good thing that I feel must come of my capture and my rescue is this. The Long Pond frogs and the marsh frogs must be at peace with each other for evermore after this. Now I would go to my friends, but I invite all of you who can come over to our marsh tomorrow night, when I think there will be a kind of jubilee, and the marsh frogs will want to speak their thanks to the frogs of Long Pond for their great kindness to their king. I am only very, very sorry that your good and wise judge, the Rock Frog, cannot come with you, but he will have the gratitude and admiration of every frog at the marsh. End of chapter 6. Recording by Linda Marie Nielsen, Vancouver, BC. Chapter 7 of the Rock Frog. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Linda Marie Nielsen, Vancouver, BC. The Rock Frog by Harriet Anna Cheever. Rejoicing at the Marsh. The remainder of the night was spent in croakings over Boom a Room's story. Then it was agreed that Father Hindlegs and a goodly number of Long Pond frogs should go over to the marsh the next night, and join in the rejoicings over the return of their king. And a merry time they had of it. The marsh frogs heard them coming, and came forth to meet them. Then over to a rich bog they hopped, where they met frogs of other tribes, who had been politely invited to join in the night's revel. Among others were a few large green frogs, from a deep pool region, that, hearing what had happened to the marsh king, came to see if he could tell anything about one of their leaders that an eagle had borne away. It was during a town meeting of Deep Pool Frogs, when this leader, who was a fine speaker, had been telling of a new law he thought should be made, that the air giant came. One of them said: "We green frogs used often to go in bunches to wade in a clear pond some little distance from our own pool and its slimy banks. But every time we went there were naughty boys around, who threw stones at us, and tried to catch us by the legs." Our leader was telling of a sly plan he had for paying those two-legged creatures for plaguing and tormenting us as they did, and that was to nibble their toes when they were in bathing, for the boy creatures were very fond of plunging into the pond and having a cool bath, and it would make them squirm well, and squeal well, too, to feel a prickling nip at their toes or heels as they were having a nice little swim. So pleased were the green frogs at this idea that we all boomed out our thanks to the leader for speaking of it, when right in the midst of our loud cries of gratitude the dreadful shadow lowered and all escaped except the leader, who was trying to help us. It is not strange that the same eagle who snapped up the Marsh King should have grabbed away our leader, who was to us such a useful fellow. True, he was planning vengeance on the boy creatures, but then it was deserved. At that, one of the green frogs said he thought it was a funny old world, and the rest of the green frogs made a loud cry of the words: "Funny old world! Funny old world! Funny old world!" Then the Long Pond frogs, the Marshers, and their other guests chimed in, and for a time the meadows all around rang with the long drawn croak: "Funny old world! Funny old world! Funny old world!" But Father Hindlegs, who was old and wise, said that they must, after all, remember that the air giant carried out the law of its nature just as truly in catching up a frog when it could as the frog did in snapping at flies or bugs. And he bade the green frogs take courage, for if Boom a Room had escaped so finely, what might not happen to help their leader? And had he not spoken of a plan by which he hoped to get free? Oh, there was much to hope for and cause them to take courage. Then they all felt better as the green frogs cheered up, and the fun began. Over skipped the frogs to some deep puddles, where they pitched head first into the water, their hind legs showing long and straight as they made great leaps. Some old daddy frogs, too stiff in the joints for such mighty springs, crooned away on the stones by the puddle, while baby frogs climbed on their backs and sat down. Others stood on their shoulders, and peeped with little googly eyes at the capers of their parents, their uncles, their cousins, and their aunts. Such a paddling and sporting and fiddling the little froglings had never seen or heard before, while all the air was filled with mixed cries of "Brek X coax, coax, Brek X coax, coax, Jug a room room roon, Jug a room room roon, Peg go drock drock drock, Peg go drock drock drock, Creak come creel creel creel, Creak come creel creel creel, Crump frump, crump frump, crump frump. There were plenty of fresh young things to eat, crisp grasshoppers that, hearing the noise, went out in big companies, slugs, bugs, and the swift little minnows that, in the small streams, would swim right up into their mouths. There was also the company of a squad of tree frogs, quite like small foreigners in the midst of the others. They were smaller than the common ground frogs and brighter in color. They moved more quickly, and their little fingers and toes were much flatter than those of either the long pounders or the marshers or the green frogs. Their skin was also smoother along the back, where it was kind of olive green with brown blotches, and underneath they were of a whitish hue. The tree frogs did not croak, but they made a kind of chirp, something like a cricket. They live like other frogs on the banks or edges of ponds or pools, and are quite tame. Sometimes people have fed and made tiny pets of them. They could make a jump that would make the other frogs stare. It was such a jump. If any traveler passed the marshy meadow that night, he surely must have wondered what was up with the frogs. But the merry jingle went on until the night had nearly worn away. One could almost have seen the dance going on, so jolly and so chirpy were the sounds. At last, when it was nearly time for the sun to come creeping up, sending a faint glow along the eastern sky, Boom a Room, the Marsh King, called a council of the wisest frogs in the company, as he had something of great importance he wished to say. And when, under the damp shadows of some long meadow grass, he told what was on his mind, the frogs put on their thinking caps and tried to make out what could be done. What the Marsh King had to say was, that he wished some bright frog or others could think of a plan by which Judge Ker Chunk, the Rock Frog, could be set free. "Think of it!" he exclaimed. "Here we have been rejoicing and celebrating the whole night through, and he, whom we all so much respect and would delight to have in our midst, is shut away from all these pleasures, and has been for years. Cannot something be done?" There was silence all around after the Marsh King had spoken, until Father Hindlegs replied: "Many times, O Boom a Room, has this thing been talked over at Long Pond, but on no plan have we been able to decide that would give our good judge his liberty. Experiments might only harm him. It is a long time since, as a child frog, he was thrust into the rock merely to be kept there for a little while. Better far to keep him there as our friend and judge, than to risk his precious life in wild schemes for his release." "But if he should be sick," asked a marsh frog, "what could you do then?" "I do not know," replied Father Hindlegs, with simple wisdom. "The Rock Frog declares that his great safety in his rocky shelter makes up for much that he misses in various ways. But a frog cannot look a day ahead. They say that men cannot either. Yet some one takes care of us all, and if our Rock Frog should fall ill, that great one would surely look after him, and it might be, would show us how we could help him." "Then our counsel is worth nothing," said the Marsh King. "Oh, yes, it is worth much," replied Father Hindlegs. "We shall tell the Rock Frog how kindly he was remembered, and of your desire to help him. Kind wishes are worth very, very much, and I am sure your words will please our judge greatly. We all thank you for them, knowing how much they will cheer him." And they really did, for after several lively young frogs had told Judge Ker Chunk of the drumming, the fiddling, the frolicking, and the rejoicing, Father Hindlegs, in a soft croak, told how anxious the Marsh King and the Council of Wise Frogs had been to set him free. Yes, the Rock Frog was truly pleased, but he swallowed hard, and his breast bulged out as he sighed. Ah, but liberty is sweet. Poor Judge Ker Chunk, sighed Father Hindlegs as he hopped toward the pond. He still finds it hard to be a prisoner. So would any one of us. Would that same kind Great One would set him free. End of chapter 7. Recording by Linda Marie Nielsen, Vancouver, BC.
Chapter 8 of the Rock Frog. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Linda Marie Nielsen, Vancouver, BC. The Rock Frog by Harriet Anna Cheever. What the Frogs Taught the Farmer. At a little distance from Long Pond was a fine, large farm, where water from the pond was carried in pipes to the barn and the family mansion. Farmer Harris was a middle-aged man who should have known some things that he never stopped to think of. So he forgot that all the creatures in the world are meant to be of use, and he would storm at harmless little flies and hoppers in a way not at all nice or noble in a great grown-up man. As he came up from a wide meadow one evening he noticed that the frogs were having a gay time, skipping around the pond, and calling to their fellows to come and skip across the meadow too. "I won't have these noisy fellows piping, chewing, swallowing, and hollering all about the farm," he said. "I'll find some way of ridding the place, both of noisy frogs and good-for-nothing toads." Farmer Harris went grumbling up to the house, and pretty soon a company of toads came leaping over to the pond, making frightened complaint of what they had heard the farmer say. Toads, you know, look like frogs, yet in many respects they are unlike them. They are like frogs in being children of the night, liking best to hop and leap about under cover of the darkness. Their hind legs are shorter than those of the frog, so they have to take shorter leaps. They do not live long either, as they are thought to live only about 40 years, which however is a long life for so small a creature. Like the frog, they eat only what is alive until being snapped at and devoured at once. Their eyes are bright as jewels, and they have little glands behind their heads from which they can send out a kind of poisonous fluid. When frightened they keep perfectly still except for swallowing, swallowing, and swallowing, as if a little stream was constantly running down their throats. If they should happen to spurt a jet of that unwholesome fluid into anyone's eyes it would make them smart miserably. They have no teeth like frogs, but like the frogs do not drink, simply absorbing or drawing in moisture through the skin. A toad is a funny creature. When it sees a nice plump fly or insects fluttering through the air, it will keep as still as though it had no life. Its eyes would seem fixed on nothing and will not move. Then, just as Buzz Buzz comes along, out darts Toady's tongue like a flash, and Buzz Buzz is seen no more. Unlike frogs, toads live on land, except early in the spring, when they sometimes take to the water. But like frogs, when cold weather comes, they creep into holes, under stumps or stones, and sleep the long winter through. How the frogs and the toads live for months without food is a mystery, but they are cared for, as is everything in nature, and nature is full of strange, amusing, and mysterious things. Judge Ker Chunk was squatting comfortably before his door when he saw a company of small dark objects coming towards the rock, and he knew at a glance that it was made up of frogs and toads. Father Hindlegs was in the procession, but it was headed by a great bullfrog who, like Boom a Room, got his name from his deep and rolling voice, which at times would make one think of the lowing of an angry ox. He was a handsome fellow, that is for a frog, with good long fingers at the end of his forelegs for sticking in the mud, and such wide webby toes at the end of his hind legs that they were as good as paddles in swimming. The webbed toes of a frog serve the same purpose in swimming as do the fins and webbed tail of a fish. Patty go Frump was a reddish brown spotted with black, with a yellow line down the middle of his back. He would sit for hours baking in the sun, then plunge into the cool waters of the pond and neither cough nor sneeze. From the quick, nervous hop of the frogs, and the steady plumping along of the more heavy bodied toads, the Rock Frog knew something had gone wrong, and imagined they were coming to him for advice. He was not mistaken. In froggy language Patty go Frump began: "Oh, our good Judge Ker Chunk, such trouble as we are in! The farmer who lives near the Long Pond is going to drive us all away from our homes, for he says we are pesters and a plague. He allows his boys to throw stones at us, and has a fearful creature called a dog that makes a great barking cry 10 times louder than our musical croaks and songs. This he will let rush us, and scaring us most dreadfully. And oh, dear Judge, such an alarming story as the toads have to tell! What can we do? What can we do?" As Patty go Frump ceased speaking, a monster toad began in a low pitched voice: "Will the kind and knowing Rock Frog listen to the sad plaint of the toads? We live at the farm near Long Pond, and the farmer who threatens to drive away the frogs means to drive or kill off the toads also. His boys and his barking creature chase us into holes and under stumps, or stone or chew us up if we do not go away. And he has sprinkled a strange white powder over the strawberry beds, the pea vines, the potatoes, and in fact all through the garden, that has made many of us very ill indeed. We come with the frogs to ask, what can we do? What can we do?" Judge Ker Chunk winked and blinked in silence a few moments. Then he sat upright, swallowed and swelled, and moved the lower lids of his tiny eyes as a frog can do when troubled or excited. At length he spoke: "My children, I will tell what will be the best thing for you all. It will take patience and seem a hard thing to do, but follow my counsel, and I think you will find that the farmer man will be glad enough to treat you all well, after my plan has been tried. Instead of letting him drive you away, go you every one, without sign or sound, and for the space of 4 weeks do not go near either pond or garden. You frogs can live very comfortably in the bog about a quarter of a mile away. The toads can hop into the woods and there abide for 4 weeks. It is not so very long to leave your homes, and it will be far better to live in peace during the rest of the summer and through the warm, dewy weeks of autumn than to be all the time in dread of what the mistaken farmer, his boys, his dog, and his harmful powders may do. It will indeed be strange and hard for us to move out entirely," drummed Patty go Frump, "but your advice shall be followed." "Will it not be hard for me?" asked the Rock Frog in an undertone croak. Then the frogs and toads saw how kind and unselfish Judge Ker Chunk had been in setting aside his own comfort and giving the best advice of which he could think. For although one or two frogs could hop over occasionally to see that the judge was all right, yet it was going to be very lonely for him, having them away for so long a time, and his advice was brave as well as wise. And although neither frogs nor toads knew what it meant, they yet felt safe in trusting him and doing as he said. And indeed he did miss them, did the Rock Frog. No tuneful fiddlings by the pond, no jigs or dancing by moonlight, no welcome leapings to the rock to tell the news, no frog races as it grew dark, no puffy, friendly toads toddling along to see the fun, and to take a turn in the round dances. But as the end of a lonely fortnight, the Rock Frog, looking from his little door, saw Farmer Harris walking along with a very sober face. "Ker chunk! Ker chunk!" muttered the judge. "My plan is working." At the end of another week the farmer passed the rock again, and this time with a troubled, anxious air. He appeared to be looking for something in the grass, and in boggy places, that he did not find. Two little round eyes watched him. "Ker chunk! Ker chunk!" chuckled the Rock Frog, with a grin that sent a slit way across his face. "How that plan of mine does work!" The night before the fourth week would be up, Judge Ker Chunk saw Farmer Harris walking slowly along, head down, hands clasped behind him, his entire appearance downcast and dejected. But hark! He is talking to himself, and the Rock Frog strains his mites of ears to catch his words. "Oh, what a fool was I, to talk of such a thing as driving away the frogs and toads! Did they hear me, and go of their own accord to teach me a serious, much needed lesson? But alas, I knew so little! When I saw that wise man to day, and told him our pond water was scarcely fit to drink, that all kinds of bugs and insects were sailing happily on the surface, he asked, 'Have you no frogs there?' And when I told the old landscape gardener that tiny creepy things and greedy crawling things were eating up my vines and vegetables, he asked, 'Have you no toads about?' Then I remembered how silent it had grown by the pond at night, and that no brown hoppers had crossed my path for several days, and I began looking in earnest and in anxiety for the useful frogs and toads. Ah me! I did not know that the frogs ate up, and in other ways did away with what was impure about the water, and that the toads took care of the creepers and the crawlers that destroyed my vines and vegetable plants. Alack! If only the frogs and the toads would come back to pond and garden, I would be their friend and protector, I would indeed." Farmer Harris strode away, head still down and hands clasped behind his back, while Judge Ker Chunk danced a jig that banged his knotty sides against the rough wall of his chamber, and it looked as though his mouth might be going to swallow his head, so fearful was the stretch of it. At night, when a frog and a toad came to inquire for his health, the Rock Frog told them they might bid the different tribes return to their homes, and neither the farmer nor anything belonging to him would do them any harm. When midnight was chiming, back they came, great leaping, hopping squads of jubilant, home returning wanderers. And when Judge Ker Chunk made them understand what Farmer Harris had said, the frogs had to get on a little extra swell at the thought of what useful creatures they were, and the toads puffed with importance at knowing the farmer could not get along without them and prosper. Before morning, the Long Pond sent out a chorus making it sound as if fairly alive, and the vines along the ground and the potato plants appeared as if alive also with hosts of active toads hopping in every direction. Daylight had not dawned when Farmer Harris stood in the meadow between pond and garden, again talking to himself. "Thank the Lord the frogs have come back, and the toads are here too. I should think every frog was trying to split his throat with the tooting it is keeping up, and the toads, I verily believe, are trying to trip me up, dancing under my feet at nearly every step. But the racket of the frogs is music in my ears, and the toads are welcome to trip me if they can." Down by the pond Father Hindlegs said to Patty go Frump, "What a wise judge is our Rock Frog." And Patty go Frump said to Father Hindlegs, "What, a knowing Rock Frog is our Judge Ker Chunk." Chapter 8 Recording by Linda Marie Nielsen, Vancouver, BC.